Hello, my name is T. Erin Gruber, and I use she, her pronouns. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Level Up Symposium presented by the Associated Designers of Canada with support from Toaster Lab's Mixed Reality Performance Atelier. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the ADC and really excited to be your host for today's event. To begin our session, I would like to acknowledge that I am currently located on Treaty 6 territory. This is the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. Edmonton, as it is known colonially, is and has been home to a diverse range of Indigenous peoples and nations, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Tsuut'ina, Inuit, and many others. Since time immemorial, this land has been a meeting place for this diverse range of Indigenous peoples who have enriched this place with their histories, languages, and cultures. As a settler, I have benefited from Indigenous generosity, hospitality, and knowledge, and for that, I wish to express my gratitude. Thank you. In this spirit of gratitude, I would like to acknowledge the support of Canada Council for the Arts, our primary funder of the symposium as a whole, as well as our dedicated member volunteers and volunteers on the board of the ADC who have made this symposium possible. We are equally grateful to these additional sponsors: IATSE, University of British Columbia, Theatre Alberta, CITT Alberta Chapter, Concordia University, Ryerson University, and York University. For your information, all symposium events will be recorded and presented in a freely available archive. Check back in a few days after any event you've missed to see the recording at levelup.designers.ca. Thank you so much for joining us today. You are watching this Level Up live stream either on the Level Up website, levelup.designers.ca, on HowlRound at howlround.com through our partners at Toaster Lab, or on the respective Facebook pages for the ADC or Toaster Lab. Regardless of your viewing platform, embedded on the same page as the video is the chat function. It's in the top right-hand corner of your screen, and if you click on that icon, questions can be asked in the chat at any time, and they'll be read out to the presenter during the Q&A portion of this session. If you have any technical difficulties at any point in the session, please send an email to levelup@designers.ca for immediate support. This event can be enjoyed through auditory or visual access, or a combination of both. I will read aloud all questions we address from the chat, and this information will also appear visually at the bottom of your stream. Visual access is also supported with captioning for myself and in the archive for all speakers. Captioning will appear directly below the active speaker. If you require technical assistance to support your access, please email levelup@designers.ca for immediate support or to provide much valued feedback following our events. If you enjoy this session, please consider donating any amount to the Associated Designers of Canada to support our National Arts Service Organization achieve its goals in the area of advocacy, membership, and industry promotion. Donation links are available in screen on all viewing platforms, so I hope that you'll consider donating. Thank you so much for your patience with our announcements. Today's event is In Your Face, featuring His Royal Highness Anand Rajaram. Anand is an improviser, actor, playwright, director, musician, teacher, and puppeteer. Most recently, he was in Buffoon by Anasha Rani and Mustard by Kat Sandler and received a Dora Award for Best Performance in each. He adapted and performed in Rahinston Mysteries' The Scream at SummerWorks, winner of Best Production, and has performed at Second City, Stratford, Can Stage, Video Cabaret, and many others. He's an accomplished film and TV performer as well as voiceover artist for video games and cartoons. You may sometimes hear him as a panelist on CBC Radio's Because News. He's also the artistic director of his own company, currently creating AR digital content for live streams under the banner of Cardboard Dreams. So welcome, Anand. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I want to apologize to the audience as well, because I was trying to get the web captioning happening on my end, and I think I hit the wrong button. Sorry about that. So hopefully it'll be archived with captioning afterwards.
Yes. Yeah.
And for my name, a good mnemonic for people remembering how to pronounce it is similar to almond, Anand.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Anand.
Yeah.
I'm so happy that you're here with us today. Just for starters, since COVID hit about a year ago, I'd love to hear a little bit about the kind of work that you've shifted into now that theaters are shuttered. What's keeping you busy these days?
Well, thanks for that question. I've been doing a lot of playing with augmented reality anyway, and particularly with Snapchat filters. Right. And I've just been playing with that on my phone. But at some point I started investigating, like, well, people must be making these. How do you make it? So then when I started doing the maker investigation, then I discovered, like, other programs and a number of tutorials. And so then I started figuring out how to make content so that I could perform in some way that's more heightened than just straight talking heads with flat backgrounds.
Yeah, absolutely. So just for those who may have less experience with it, although I think Snapchat is a great, super accessible example, these when we talk about augmented reality masks, what's the viewing experience? What do people see on their screen?
It'll be, I mean, an augmented reality experience, for those who don't know, different than, say, a virtual reality experience, is that augmented reality takes the existing reality and then augments it. So, for example, a mask on Snap camera would be, for example, if I did this. Do you see this?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is directly mapped onto my face, and you can tell that it's not my face, but with suspension of disbelief, it's easier to get you to buy into that I'm performing as Alfred Hitchcock this way than if I were to just say that I was Alfred Hitchcock.
Fantastic. And welcome Alfred Hitchcock to our performance today. Thank you so much for that demonstration. It really, I think, helps contextualize for people the work that we're talking about. Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say the suspension of disbelief is a really powerful tool that the theater uses and sometimes plays with, and the idea of the fourth wall and everything else. And so part of the augmented reality experience is understanding what are you asking the audience to suspend, and where can you pull them and stretch them in another direction, where they'll say, well, okay, I know it's not you. I know that's not your face, but I'll go with you because I can see that you're putting on the affectation. So let's go into the affectation and see where it takes us. And that's a really big departure from our understood experience of video modalities and filmic modalities, which try to do great similarity with reality, so that real locations and so we. When I first started playing with augmented reality, that was kind of the response, is people said, oh, well, you know, I can tell it's not real. But obviously you could tell it's not real. It's only if you compare it to film and TV that you get into difficulty. So it's a question of reconfiguring the audience as well as the work itself to create a completely different field of play.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, this exploration of, you know, now that it's not just film and television artists who are making digital works that are being presented in this screen format, but it's also theater artists, and it's also people who work in other modalities. How are we bringing our knowledge and understanding of a theatrical or a live modality into the digital space? And I think that's what's so unique about what you're doing, is you're bringing the things from, you know, from mime, from mask, from all these different modes and all these different areas that you have so much expertise, and you're finding almost like a digital tool to express those same modalities, as opposed to trying to go for realism, you know? So we're finding new ways to express these different modalities.
Yeah, totally.
Can you talk a little bit about how this use of this mask that kind of can erase you while you remain so present, as you said, like nobody is fooled by it. We all know it's you still. How has being able to change your sort of physical markers and identity representations, what kind of sort of critiques or areas of exploration in terms of topics and content has that allowed you to push into?
I think fundamentally it's everything to do with an audience experience, and everything to do with an audience's willingness to buy into the narrative and to the experience that they're watching. Right now, we're having all of these conversations about accessibility and equity in terms of availability for people to perform in certain roles in certain ways. The untold truth of every theater that has ever said that they have a challenge with diversity, with casting diversely in a play. Fundamentally, what they're saying is, we think our audience is racist. Our audience is incapable of suspending that reality. And so we are going to represent those audience members who are incapable of doing that. We won't figure out a way to let the audience into the experience. We'll just put the barrier up. And that's deeply problematic. First of all, I think it's highly insulting of audiences that, especially with a show like Mime. When I did Mime, there's no set, there's no costume per se, apart from the clothes that I'm wearing. And everything is an imagined reality. And I created, along with Bob Wiseman, I created a 90-minute mime show, which went through a series of different not only different locations and different times and different characters, but also different scale and sizes. At one point, I had a devil-like creature climb into my mouth, and
Right.
then I transformed into a giant creature, and
Mhm.
with no kind of backdrop or anything to scale off of. It just took the audience to watch my corporal movement to say, oh, I understand contextually the story, because I've already got all those images in almost a McLuhan
Mhm.
way embedded in my head that I'm filling in all the details. And the
Yeah.
audience will do the same. If you walk out on stage and declare you're something, they'll say, okay, well, so now what? But a theater that's unwilling to even do that first step puts up all these barriers that are really unfortunate, because it means differently abled people. There's gendered conversation, there's racial conversations. Everything has hit a real stall because of this, where augmented reality, in terms of ability, there are challenges, ableist challenges, absolutely, with this modality. But one of them is not the inability to not enter a building that doesn't have a ramp, for example. Here, you're in the exact same space as I am, as you are.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
everyone's in the same equal space. You're given the same size. You're given, there's not an upstage, downstage, standing
Mhm.
in the shadows versus the lead and the main position. It's a complete shift in the equity of performance and accessibility, because then it's driven on what does the actor bring to a character, not what does the actor look like as the first filter.
Absolutely. Well, and what's really interesting too is you remove what we're seeing in a way is that performers like you who have, experience in the field and have an audience, people know you, that you can connect directly with your audience. There's no more sense that you need to be cast in a role in order for an audience to see you. You can present your work in whatever format you want to, and explore whatever format you want to, and sort of reach your own audience directly. So I think that's become something really interesting that we've already seen a little bit in the sort of YouTube, Instagram phenomenon over the last 10, 15 years, but that now with COVID and the inability for people to go to these institutions and engage with art through this mediated form of sort of, whatever the gatekeepers are producing, that now, artists have a new pipeline in a way, if they choose to access it in order to present their work.
Yeah,
How does that change the kind of work that you're able to do?
it changes everything. It really does fundamentally change everything. This is a nascent art form that is not like, it's got the liveness potentially of theater if you choose to do it live, although you can do it recorded.
Yeah.
So it has the liveness of theater if you want it, in terms of the immediacy of the response and the performance and the improvisation. And it's at the early stages of the quality of production that you could have in a filmic context. I mean, right now we're at an early stage where we're only just talking heads still, but we're not that far away. I mean, I think Snap Camera's already put in implementation. If I had full body, for example, so full body, I can create augmented reality objects flying around me or things coming out of my head.
Mhm.
There's so many variations of how I can play and do it in a live, immediate sense. So it changes my ability to be creative, my ability to perform. But the other thing that it does is it allows me to connect not only with audiences, but performers globally in the exact same space, in the exact same time. So
Mhm.
it's a complete game changer. And what's remarkable to me is I've shown this to a number of people. I've shown it to a number of like artistic directors or other performers, and people think it's cool. Everyone's kind of into the idea, but I think everyone's waiting for somebody to do that one show that everybody goes, oh, whoa, look, it's viable. It's actually
Right.
possible. And then everybody will model after it. But it's an early stage now where I don't think there's anybody that I've come across yet, or any work I've come across yet, that is that piece.
Yeah. Yeah, it's still something that everyone's exploring, but it hasn't it's like the early airplane. It hasn't quite take flight yet.
Sure.
Everyone's kind of building their wings, but no one's quite got off the ground with it yet, which is sort of an
Yeah.
exciting place for us to have a conversation about this, because I hope for anyone watching that they're inspired to check it out themselves and maybe take up that challenge a little bit to create that project, to be that person who kind of breaks through that barrier. I know that one of the projects that you worked on was adapting a film in a way to include other performers, including yourself, in an improvised mode. Can you talk a little bit about how this particular tool compared to some other tools that enable us to pre-record content or manipulate content. How does this particular tool enable you to play with live improvisation, which is something I know a lot of us have been missing?
Yeah, I think this allows live improvisation to happen in a way that is significantly, I mean, in one way, it robs the live experience of the audience inventing the backgrounds and the scenery and everything else. So there is that challenge. But on the other hand, it greatly liberates the performer to be able to rapidly switch between characters without the audience getting confused. And in terms of the film that I did, there's more than one project that's kind of in the works. But one of the initial tests that I did was this film from the 1950s called DOA, which is I chose it because I searched for public domain films, and
Right.
it came up, and the fidelity, the beauty of it's a beautiful black and white film. So I stripped all the audio out of it, and then I cut this 90-minute film down to about half an hour, fundamentally interstitials, so that I could have characters move to locations, and as soon as they get into dialogue, then we cut into the actors, the improvisers wearing the masks, having the conversation with other improvisers wearing the masks. And then when we go to the larger kind of medium frame, wide frame, interstitial shots, the actors would dub it over the same way as in What's Up, Tiger Lily?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I found so interesting about this when I was watching it is it combined a number of different things I could relate to. So for instance, I'm kind of Harry Potter generation. So there was at one point, someone had taken the entire first Harry Potter movie and they dubbed the whole thing. And this was like in the early days of YouTube, this was like something everyone was watching. And I've seen it many times. It's very funny. So it was able to combine this idea of an existing film that other creators are putting a new story on top of or new characters on top of by overdubbing. But then it also, to me, really felt a little bit like when you're watching someone play like a D&D game online or even a video game online, and we have a little bit of that. We feel a bit of the backstage chatter. We feel a bit of the strategy is present. We're seeing people build it as you go. Are you seeing people problem solve as you go? And there were a little bit of elements of that, of seeing the performers. Oh, okay, suddenly I'm in the shot again. Okay, how do I respond? Who's my character? And so I really liked that liveness. And I think, I used to think it was so weird that people would watch someone else play a video game, but relating it to something I understand better, which is this idea of improvised theater, it was really interesting to me to see this piece, this DOA version of DOA you made, because it was kind of like that. It was sort of like the experience of, watching someone play a video game for theater nerds.
Yeah, totally.
So, yeah.
No, totally. It increases audience agency for sure.
Yeah.
It increases the audience agency, and it allows us to do something in a way that we've never ever done before, which is take properties that already exist. And we're already really deep within remix culture. Remix culture has been happening for a very long time.
Yeah, decades.
So deep within remix culture, we've got this massive treasure trove of images, paintings, drawings, art, films that we can use, that are all kind of sitting in our collective kind of memory, and reconfigure them. And that also comes with its own challenges, but it comes with a great possibility for new work, new creation.
Yeah, and I think it comes with speaking a bit to your point earlier, breaking down these a bit of like white supremacist models that are entrenched in our society. By remixing things that exist, it gives us an opportunity to really kind of like mess with the existing canon and like find inroads for people to see things, like reframing things. And so much of the work and research I've been doing personally around understanding being part of a white supremacist society involves reframing things with a new context, a new perspective, a different lens. And this idea of being able to take works of art or works of fiction that we're familiar with and sort of like break them open, crack open those crab legs and see what we can do to them is really exciting. I think the idea of putting tools like that into the hands of artists like you in particular, with your voice is just super liberating.
Yeah.
Feel that way for you?
I definitely feel like it's a massive new avenue that I'm really excited to devote a lot more time into and towards developing. And I should say too, I mean, we recognize now, I think, that there are white supremacist models, but the vast majority of people that I know would say that they're either not aware of it, or if they are aware of it, they don't know how to extricate one element of it from another. So I should also qualify and say that when I say earlier that these theater companies were catering towards those white supremacist ideas without knowing that they were doing that, without acknowledging they were doing that, it's not to say that they were intentionally trying to cause harm. It's that it's a fear-based, fear-driven idea, and that's partly because of cost, and risk-taking and everything else. But I'm more interested. I'm less interested in pushing this medium from the place of social justice and that,
Yeah.
and more starting from the place of it's a form of art, and there's tremendous a possibility. And one thing that's quite remarkable, my dear friend Trina Dasgupta, I also made a live sitcom, like a cartoon sitcom,
Yeah.
and it's with these it's a South Asian family that lives in Sudbury. So you know, that we haven't ever seen a cartoon that's live. That's also a really new idea.
Yeah.
But you know, if I suddenly start to play a character like this, it's quite incredible to see a cartoon come to life. You know,
Yeah.
and have kind of this nuanced things that you can do with a cartoon that you can't quite do in animation because it's too much work. You know.
Mm.
Oh, sorry. There we
I
go.
think that's a really amazing idea too, that giving people that power of creating, because you can create things in an animated world that can never exist in reality, or much less exciting when you see them in reality. So, you know, and introducing the ability to have a live performer with all of their skill and ability sort of transposed into that environment is super exciting. And even just the idea of having interactive backdrops or other things, and at times we may want to see the performer's face, or they may be able to play multiple. They can play themselves, you know, or they can play a masked character as well. I think that's a really interesting way that we can use, you know, one performer to play multiple roles, almost like Mr. Dress Up style, where there's like one human and then multiple puppets all around them. We can play with, like, you know, seeing or not seeing the live performer in video format. I think that's
totally. It also goes to even Commedia would have the masked and unmasked lovers, you know. So it falls, it's a very old traditional idea that we're actually building on. And to that end, when I was in India, I was researching a performance form called Kathakali, and that comes from an earlier form called Kuriyatam, and that's probably from an earlier form still. But these forms, you can Google them to see images. It's quite stunning to look at as a performance form. When I spoke to one of the performers, they would perform in these temples because they'd perform at night, you know, from 11 p.m. until 5 a.m. or something. And so I'd speak to these performers and I'd say, look, you're doing these shows. There's people sleeping. There's kids running around. There's people eating and talking on the phone. Like, doesn't that bother you? And the performer said, no, that's not part of our training. Our training fundamentally is we're not performing for an audience. The audience is bearing witness while we perform towards an idea of Godhead. And if we don't have that feedback from the audience, it's okay. We have feedback from each other, and we kind of train ourselves for 15 years to work without shifting tremendously to an audience feedback. And in a way, that's where we're moving into this digital form, because you and I are having this conversation. We can't see the audience that's relatively speaking back to us. So in a manner of speaking, the audience is the Godhead right now.
Yeah, we have to have faith. We have to have faith that you're all out there listening.
Totally. But it really means
does require a kind of faith. Yeah.
Totally. It's, I mean, what it comes down to is completely shifting the performance form so that it's not based on the old ideas that we had before. The old thing of like, how are the audience tonight? Well, you know, we should go a little faster. They're not really with the jokes, or they're really enjoying it. You don't get any of that kind of feedback with this forum. So you have to train towards a much more closed sense of self-direction.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to have a different kind of inner well, right? You have to be drawing on your own inner artistic impulse and that idea that you're creating for something else, right? And this is sort of this idea beyond, and everyone has their own opinions about this, but, you know, what are we creating for? Where are we getting our energy from? And I think for so many of us in the live experience, we crave that feedback, right? We crave that external energy, that external almost validation that the work we're making is meaningful and has meaning for others. And in this new modality of creating, you know, for the wide internet, you know, we have to almost find a new method of gratification. Like, you know, and I think in some ways this also asks the question as artists, like which, you know, what are we creating for? Are we creating ultimately for the satisfaction of the audience, or are we finding new values that drive our creation modes? And that's something that I know for myself since COVID hit, I had to really re-examine as an artist, that if I, you know, for myself as a visual designer, I'm usually part of a much bigger project. And I don't ever experience that direct relationship with the audience like a performer would on stage. But I'm still creating with this idea that, you know, X number of tickets will likely be sold, or this community in particular in this geographical location is going to receive this information, or this tour is going to go to this many communities that might not otherwise see theater. You know, these are the things that drive me, and having to re-examine, okay, well, what is driving the artistic impulse, and can there be other things that inspire us that can even potentially bring us to a new place artistically as creators that we never would have gotten from the old model. So
Yeah, totally.
instead is like an evolution as opposed to something we're missing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a manner speaking, what you do as a designer is you're kind of doing a kind of architecture, because you're creating a space with limitations of some movement and access and great freedom in other movement and access, and the room for a lot of poetic definition of space. So if you take existing modalities, everything that we need for creating this form or even the future forms to come from this are already in existence. We just have to now think outside the box and start to link ideas that we didn't link before. There's some questions here.
Yeah, there is a question here. One of the questions we have from our audience is, speaking of our audiences, how might your work in puppetry combine with this digital work? How do they influence each other?
It's a great question. First of all, there was a question there. Is HRH is His Royal Highness? That's correct. I crown myself king, so it's His Royal Highness. Right. Yes, that was your question. Okay. So how puppetry might combine with this digital work? I think with puppetry, this is actually closer in the way that we're doing it because it is mapped reality. I think it's closer to voiceover. It's closer to cartoon voiceover and projection of self into a character. So it's not puppetry in the sense of like hand and rod of a static object that's manipulated. Although you can have aspects of that with the augmented reality objects around you. And Pokemon Go is a very classic example of that. So if there was some sort of gestural thing that I could do with my hand here, and I created a Snapchat filter that when I open my hand like this, then suddenly something starts rotating in the palm, for example. And then when I close it, it disappears. That's one way that might be more clearly used. Puppet ideas might be used, but in puppetry and actually creating a character that is then moving around, I'm sure we'll get to the point that I can do this and then have this augmented reality now superimposed with a puppet on top that I could have having a conversation with me. And I think that is not so far off in the future. And so it's probably doable right now, in fact.
Yeah, if you had a way to like write the code so that this could be recognized with the facial recognition or whatever and assign it to another character, that could be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there already is digital recognition, digital meaning digits like fingers. So there's digital recognition and hand recognition.
Mm-hmm.
When I did early iterations of this, it was really clunky, but I think they've fixed a lot of the clunkiness now. But it would be that if I put my hand up, then I could automatically turn my hand into a banana if I wanted to.
Right. Yeah,
it would map a banana onto the shape of it as soon as it pops up. So there are some drawbacks to this, but sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, did you have a question?
I was just going to say, as soon as you did this, I was immediately imagining like Dragon Ball Z, like a globe, like some kind of energy force power that you could like send into the world.
Yeah, totally.
And there's so many references, like even just in that moment that it tweaked something for me that, working in this square, we instantly bring up different kinds of references for our audiences. So we're thinking about our cartoons from childhood. We're thinking about our video games that we love. Like this is going to bring up a different cultural expectation than the fourth wall in the theater brings up. And so being able to recognize that, and instead of saying, okay, well, I still want to I still want everyone thinking about, we're doing, this is Waiting for Godot, and that's the framework I want people to bring to it. It's like, no, that's foolish. Why don't we think about what the kind of cultural reality of this frame produces for people and for the individuals who might be watching, and maybe they're from different communities, so it brings up different things for them, and we can bring them in, like finding ways to bring people in with all of those references and ideas that are coming to mind, as opposed to trying to shut it out and say, okay, we're co-opting this as some kind of theater space.
Yeah, I think one of the things that have happened significantly with immigration, with refugees being brought into country or being allowed to come into countries or move into countries, with culture shifting and changing the way it has, is that our ground foundation of reference has shifted greatly, so that a word, a phrase, a gesture in one culture means something entirely in another. And so there's all sorts of jokes about the miscommunications around that idea. But now we're moving into the world being much more in general, much more able to access digital content. So all of a sudden, our collective identity becomes defined by that global culture. So to that extent, you can use forms and you can use images from kind of any place, any idea, because the culture of the media itself becomes its own defining kind of reference point. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's almost like we can get as specific as we want in our work, or we almost have this new ability to blow it up, and it's almost this kind of infinite source of, as you said, with remix culture, this kind of infinite resources. We have one more question from the group,
Yes.
which here is, what are the drawbacks, presumably, of these augmented reality formats that you've been working with?
There's some really significant drawbacks that I've flagged for now. I'm sure there's more to come, but I mean, one is an economic drawback for those who are not able to access the technology. Obviously, that's a drawback. If they don't have a broadband connection to be able to broadcast, if they don't have a computer, if they don't have, a microphone, just kind of the basic things. The software itself is free, but your computer needs to be at least, I think, 6 or 7 years, no more than 6 or 7 years old in order to be able to run the software. So there's that economic reality. However, entering into the space, once you have the computer, all of that is free. You can broadcast for free, and the software is free, as I say. So that's one limitation. A second limitation is that I have the ability, if I want to, and it can be, people might enjoy, if all of a sudden I'm Al Pacino and I'm having a conversation with you, and there's an extent to which you'd say, okay, well, that's fine, that's acceptable. Your imitation's not very good, but I accept that you're Al Pacino right now. But you'll allow me that. But now what happens with digital blackface? What happens with if I was to take a character, if I was to take an actor in the public sphere, and we move into the frame of deepfake, we move into the frame of, like, in a short frame of time, suddenly we've decided through citizen journalism that your cell phone video has tremendous validation to validate all of the claims of oppression of the state in a way that we wouldn't have believed before, because it's always, well, the press didn't report it, or how do I know that's true? And the video kind of says, well, now you can't say it's not true. But now we're moving into deepfakes very quickly, where that can get invalidated again. So that's a secondary problem, is we have to collectively start to work on this and not let it get away from us, so that we can put some of those restrictions up to know what the best practices are for our audiences. The third one is rather sinister, and I'm hoping, again, with checks and balances, that it doesn't get out of control. But in order for this technology to fundamentally work, it needs facial recognition. So you're contributing to a digital database that can now track you if it's taken into the wrong hands, and that's very dangerous. Being in a public eye already as a performer, I kind of figure, well, my image is already out there. But for those who don't put their image out there, which is less and less people these days with Instagram and everything else, there is that risk of if you don't have the proper democratic checks and balances in your society, that it can be a great detriment.
Yeah, and we have to all really actively choose to engage, or choose that we're uncomfortable with it. I think that one of the reasons that this functions, this idea of, information tracking and all of the resources that, Google and Microsoft and all of these companies are able to amass from us, Facebook is a classic example, is that people sign up thinking it's free. It's free, it's not a big deal, like, oh, it'll be fine. And Mark Caniglio made a great point in one of our earlier discussions last week about how, realistically, terms and service agreements should never be longer than what someone could reasonably read in about 5 minutes,
right,
and reasonably actually absorb. But if we look at these terms and service agreements, they're like pages and pages and pages. I read one of them all the way through one time as an exercise, and it took me like 2 hours. So, every time you click that terms and services, I accept, we don't actually know all the time what we're signing away or what we're giving people permission to do, in terms of how our information is collected. And so this question of, well, do they already know everything about us, and so it's just one more thing? Or, are we going to try and protect our image, try and protect ourselves from this kind of tracking? So I think it's a really important question that you bring up, because it's one that sort of, it became culturally acceptable to share our information before this examination of what that really means began happening, I think, sort of, at least in my experience, in a meaningful way. So it's a really valuable thing for you to bring up. I'm so grateful you mentioned it.
Yeah, there's an additional, I mean, there's different ways that we can inoculate ourselves against this kind of stuff that's happening. I mean, the real danger with Facebook, Google, anybody getting our information is not that our identities are going to get stolen. The great benefit is that they can figure out what do we want, anticipate it before we want it, and then sell us those things. So if we learned as a culture, as a community, how to inoculate ourselves against advertising, and one way that I'd recommend it to people is when you're going through a public space, if you're in a public space and you see an ad somewhere and you don't like that there's an ad there, make a note of where you are, the time of day, and what the ad is. Then send an email to the company and say, Nestle, I saw your billboard. It was here, and I recognize your product. I know who you are. I know your brand, and I don't like you. And so I'm going to make it a point never to buy you when I see your brand on anything. Brand recognition is entirely what they want. They want you to remember them. But if you remember them with a negative connotation, you've kind of erased their way of doing business.
Yeah, I kind of make it a personal mission to get as many ads that are irrelevant to me as possible on the internet. And I often feel like quite proud when they advertise something to me that is totally irrelevant to my life. It's like, okay, good. I have managed to, sow enough misinformation about who I actually am that they're not succeeding at their mission.
Right.
Yeah. So here's a great question in the chat here. Yes, regarding all those drawbacks, especially the final comment. How do you deal with IP, or do you? IP being intellectual property.
So intellectual property, if you mean about my own intellectual property that I'm broadcasting, I haven't put any confines on that when I'm using, especially when I'm using things that are digitally sourced. Then it's kind of the open remix culture that I don't. I mean, if there's ever a misuse of my work in some way, then I could go after that. But if you're talking about intellectual property of an image of somebody who exists, that in addition is one of those challenges. There's a project that I started working on, and I've kind of put it on the side because I'm a little anxious about it, which was I was creating a project called Ship of Fools, which is a group of flat earthers know that the world is falling apart. There's climate change, and there's, all of this civil unrest that's happening. And they think the only way to solve the problem is to go to the end of the earth where no one has gone before in order to save civilization. And so it just becomes a continuous kind of series of these people on this boat. And there's a variety of people on the boat. And then through that, there's a television, there's internet, so you can play multiple personalities and stuff on there. But in order to take it away from the idea of only using recognized celebrities, I looked in free stock photo databases. But now all of a sudden I thought, well, what is the ethics around that? If someone has given their face to a free stock photo and I suddenly capitalize on it and create it for this product, that's not what they intended. But is that fair game? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. And again, that comes down to best practices. Somebody is going to exploit that if they haven't already. I mean, I'm sure it has been exploited. There's all sorts of people across the political spectrum using stock photo images to sell agenda that those people have not expressly agreed to. So that's already happening, the co-opting of that. So I assume that's going to be part and parcel of the larger conversation.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, this idea too, when we start talking about, a stock image of a photograph of someone. And as you say, they have not given permission for you to represent their face with certain opinions, ideas, thoughts, feelings, and sort of use it in that way. But this idea that going back to your cartoon, so, if you draw a character, that suddenly you can imbue it with anything because it's any likeness is unintentional, and you can easily prove that it's unintentional because, well, I drew it or I hired this person to draw it. And I think that this is a way in which designers can become incredibly potent in this creation mode, is that we can create original content that is not linked to a specific body. We could even begin with a photo. And this is something I use in my work all the time because I do a lot of projected media, sort of pre-COVID. And I do a lot of composite imagery. So generally the rule on free use is that if the original creator wouldn't recognize it, then you can use it. And so I tend to use 3, 4, 5, a dozen images in a single picture because I'm trying to create something A, that's very unique, but B, I also want to make sure that whatever I'm putting out into the public with my name on it is modified sufficiently that I can really claim it. And so this idea of, starting with that, potentially you did start with a stock image, but then, you're collaging the eyes, or you're doing something to manipulate it in a way that both meets your needs dramaturgically through the story, but then also B, helps you to navigate this pathway in an ethical way that you support. So this idea of, how realistic does it need to be? Or as you move away from realism, like we talked about at the very beginning, kind of looping back, do you then move more into a place where actually your artistic point becomes the driving force, and it becomes less a question of, well, who's that actor? Who's that person?
Right.
Yeah. So in a way, kind of making, again, your artistic vision become the primary experience of the audience. And there's not that sort of distraction of, well, where did they get that person?
Yeah. One of the unfortunate challenges of IP conversations, intellectual property conversations, is that it's corporate driven. I mean, It Takes a Nation of Millions, the Public Enemy album, is astounding because there are hundreds and hundreds of samples on that album, but they didn't clear them all because it was an open time where those conversations weren't happening. And after that, there were great restrictions on how you could sample, which it didn't limit creativity. I mean, people are still very creative and they're still creating a lot of work. But I do feel that human civilization, for as long as it's existed, has always been about the communal sharing of ideas, the communal sharing of development, which is also why properties that I create, unless somebody's monetizing it, I'm like, if you're on my Twitter, I post puns and poetry and stuff all the time. And people have told me, you should commodify it and put it into a book. But I'm like, well, it's already free. It's there free. So I don't know why I would put the effort in making a book, but I guess if you'll buy it, I'll make it. But I don't really, I'm in a society which no human being can ever be paid their worth. Because the life is never going to be something that you can put a price on. So as many opportunities that I have in my society to be able to sustain my life and sustain my livelihood, my way of giving back is to create free content constantly. And that's, I think it's my civic duty as much as my way of giving back, as much as my way of kind of building my brand and building who I am and exercising my work. So I think there's a great interplay with that. And so you can't have an intellectual property conversation really without having a larger conversation about capitalism.
And without having a really introspective conversation also about how you feel about your personal values, right? So that's your perspective on it. Somebody else may have a totally different perspective on what they're willing to share for free or what they're willing to share with the public versus their friends. And so I think that's a really meaningful thing that for each of us as individuals, we have to consider the broad picture of the corporate reality in which we exist, but we also need to do this introspective work, and it is work of really examining, what is my art for? How do I make a living outside of my art or with my art? What portion of my artwork am I willing to share for free? What portion do I put a premium on? How do I engage agents or other, secondary parties to help negotiate for me or on behalf of me? Like, all of these questions have always existed, I think, for artists, and in a way for artists more so than other creators, because in our contemporary Western society, we really see art as something that should be free. Like this expectation that you would pay artists is something we're always having to advocate for, versus you would never expect someone to do your taxes for you for free. But this idea that you should just be able to walk down the street and there'll be a fantastic musician on the street corner singing to you, and that costs you nothing, and you expect this in your life. We've come to expect art and culture to sort of arrive by default. And I think now that people are being forced to go to their computers and find the people that they're interested in experiencing in a new way, at least when it comes to live performance, we're opening a conversation about not only intellectual property, but also artists' rights in terms of, what am I willing to give for free, and what do I want to keep behind the paywall? And we've seen this now in platforms like OnlyFans and Patreon. And so we're beginning to see these platforms that are really working for people like illustrators and video content creators, that they want to put people, here's what I'm willing to give for free, but the projects that take me more time and more effort, I'm putting now behind this paywall. So that's a really interesting resource that started to exist for artists in a way where the beginning of YouTube culture, this expectation that anyone would make money off of it didn't exist. Like,
right.
YouTube wasn't paying anybody in the beginning. It was something that evolved out of it. So
Well, I think that there's a really good point about that is YouTube when it started only built as a brand and only built as a thing of value because people contributed for free.
Yeah.
And so the corporation, I think, completely is indebted to the viewer, or not just the viewer base, but the creator base having that creation happen in the first place. But corporate interests tend to not they don't tend to value that. They tend to like mock that. I think
Well, it's
in
not
meme
their
culture,
interest for it to have value. If culturally it had value, or if sociologically it had value, then they would go bankrupt. Because if they had
right,
to pay everyone for their content, it wouldn't exist, right? So,
right. I mean, well, it's just a question of thinking a different model, a new
yeah.
model, or a new way of working the system. I mean, the Bernie meme that went around that was so fantastic. I don't know how many memes have actually paid off for people. There's certain people who've become internet famous because of goofy things that they've been seen doing, and so they kind of spin that into maybe something. I know, like there was a guy, oh, I've forgotten his name now, but he was mocked because of his audition in American Idol many years ago, and he's on Cameo right now.
Oh, is
William
that the
Hung.
Gangnam Style
William Hung. No, William Hung.
artist? Oh, okay. I'm mixing
William
things up.
Hung. Gangnam
Yeah.
Style is an actual legitimate great song.
Yeah,
William Hung
yeah.
was not a very good performer or
Right.
singer, but became a mockery, and so
Yeah.
he's on Cameo. You can get William Hung to sing "She Bangs, She Bangs" for you if you want.
Right.
But the Bernie meme, the reason that's so smart is that he took the meme that exploded, and then they put it on a sweatshirt, and they immediately sold out, and all the money got donated to a food bank. So
Right.
there's a way of figuring out how to monetize the culture without the monetizing coming first.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really exciting concept. And I think another thing, just sort of take the conversation in another direction, is this idea, all of this, underpinning all of this is that there have to be people engaging with the content.
Right.
And so this whole question around how do we engage, or how do we ask an audience to engage, or how do we include them? We talked a little bit earlier about it in your improvisation around, people can give suggestions or whatever, and that can drive an improvised performance. But I'm curious about, when you and I spoke last, we talked a little bit about the research you had done in India and these dance forms, and this idea that people are doing other things, they're cooking, they're eating, they're hanging out with their kids, they're having naps, but the content is still happening, the work is still happening. And can you speak a little bit to how you could imagine that that new idea of our audience having a split focus relates a little bit to something like this, where you and I are having a conversation, but there's also this simultaneous chat happening that we're either able to engage with when we're ready, or not, depending on, our own ideas about it. So this idea, I've had a lot of conversations with creators lately who are very stressed out. They don't want there to be a chat function because they think, oh, it's going to distract people. They'll be reading the chat and they won't be paying attention to the work we're making.
Right.
And I just keep saying, yes, but if you try and get someone to watch a video for 45 minutes with no engagement, after a minute and a half, they're like off on Facebook. Like the chance of them actually giving it their attention is very slim. And what we've been discovering in a lot of these conversations is you have to have ways for people to put themselves into the process. So
yeah, I mean, what's the famous axiom? Like, you never perform with kids and dogs,
yeah.
or kids and animals. And it's because they take focus. But if you ever find yourself on stage with a kid or an animal, if you're not a good performer, you're going to fight. You're going to fight to get attention away, and it's not going to work. You'll lose.
Yeah.
So you structure it so that that is an embedded part of the show, and you figure out how to synthesize. You synthesize the chat function as much as you synthesize a dog being on stage with you.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful word, that synthesize, that we're, as opposed to seeing all these things as competing factors, that we're seeing them now as tools that are beneficial.
Totally.
Can you speak a little bit to being part of those audiences where we didn't have this kind of Western, like sit and hush and be quiet and stare at the stage modality? What was that experience in terms of being in the audience like?
It was actually really liberating. It was liberating because I wasn't, there wasn't the kind of, I mean, I have to choose my words carefully because my go-to word would have been, there wasn't a fascistic silence, but I can't use that now because we're too close. We're too close right now. So let's say that let me say it this way. When The Kink in My Hair played at the Royal Alex, and I was at that show, I remember the dissent in the audience, because there were some audience members who typically didn't go to the theater, but if they did, they had a talkback functional way of responding that was way more. It was so immediate in the way that they would shout to the stage and yell at the stage and boo performers or celebrate performers, or that kind of interaction, which is actually not from that long ago. I mean, we had it early part of the 20th century.
Yeah.
You know, of people yelling encore or whatever, and then they do a monologue again or something. So we had that kind of function. And then somewhere along the way, and I think it really, class is a big part of it, we kind of shut down the possibility so that when you enter a space like a theater, you're expected to be quiet and put off your phone and not eat and not drink and not watch your phone and not do anything else, but sit and respect to the performer and watch the thing you're performing. And I think there's great value in a meditative sense of an audience being able to do that. I think that's a really good thing for an audience to have the ability to do that. So the theater has to decide how much they put that kind of confine on it or not. But when I went to see this Kathakali performances and people were doing all these things around me, because the performers weren't thrown by it, I wasn't thrown by it. I looked to them to tell me how to respond. And I just watched them with enormous commitment doing the thing that they're doing, because they synthesized. They didn't try to fight. They synthesized and said, this is the reality of the world. This is our space now, but the world is always going to be moving. It's always going to be active. My focus is towards that one firelight, which connects me to my ancestors, the ancestral tradition, as well as to the idea of Godhead. So it requires a kind of humility and a kind of a rethink entirely of the foundational way that we create.
Yeah, and I think that we're in the middle of that rethink when we're talking about digital work, right? We're in the middle of having to really re-examine what our performance modalities look like. And so that framework is so helpful for us. And I'm so grateful that you mentioned it. It's such a useful and interesting area of research for us to hear about from you.
It's really, I think it sounds like a small difference, but it's incredibly profound.
It is.
It impacts in a really profound way the difference in approach, even in terms of the style of performance. The styles of performance that we have now gotten attributed, like sort of gotten accustomed to, is a performer, for example, Robert De Niro, gaining tremendous amounts of weight for Raging Bull, where other performers after, like John C. Reilly was talking about doing that Laurel and Hardy movie, and the director said, so do you want to gain the weight, or would you rather? And he was like, no, why would I? No, of course not. I want prosthetics.
Yeah.
Why would I put my body through that? And
yes.
There's a big difference in the argument. I'm not saying De Niro's right or John C. Reilly's right, but I'm saying a performer who's put in the place that their job is to sacrifice their body for the performance is very, very specific modality. It's not the only one, but we've come to understand it as an understood thing that you should do, as a method idea. And all we've seen is the excesses of it, where people lose their mind. And it's dangerous. Yeah. It's not right.
I absolutely agree with that. I'm really, I often would comment on this in conversations sort of pre-COVID about this idea of, reality versus theatricality, and film being this place where reality is expected and desirable. And as a designer, challenging directors often to say, okay, this is maybe the way that they did it on Broadway when they had $2 or $3 million and they could actually like bring the car on stage. But if somebody wants to see a car, they can go out to their garage. They didn't come to the theater to see a car. Like, let's talk about something else we can do. What's something new we can do? What's something we can show them that they wouldn't see in the parking lot on the way in? Like, and people think, oh, but the spectacle is so exciting to have a car will come out on stage. And I think if you're interested in cars, go to a car show. Like what we're doing here is art making. So how do we make something that they would never see in another context? And in the early days of using projection design and projection mapping a lot, I would often, even now, is there any other way we can do it? Because if there's any other way to tell this story, we don't want to use this mode. And I think that's sort of the conversation we need to have now around these digital styles is, if this story can only be told live in a theater with everyone quiet, giving it its full focus, then let's not do it now. Let's wait and let's do that in a future time, or let's respect that this play has been done enough already in human history and doesn't need to be done anymore. What can we do with this modality? And this is what I love about the work that you've been doing is, you started with some ideas and some concepts, but you really said like, what's exciting about this form and how can we use that?
Right.
And I think that can be an interesting point of entry.
And also a big part of that too is inadvertently, what problems does this solve as much as what problems does it create? And I think people tend to think about what are the problems it creates first and foremost.
Yeah.
Where if you think about the problems that it solves, the interactivity, for example, I mean, since we're using these masks and there is the danger of using a photograph of a person as a mask, without their express permission. Well, that the way to synthesize that is you build a show where you ask an audience to submit a photo, and all of a sudden they enjoy the fact that their face is one of the characters, and that you're telling them, or they're manifest in this movie, their favorite movie, and they're now the lead actor in the movie. There's a way to use it in a way that you create something better without having to feel there's a restriction.
And I think as artists, we've always engaged, generally, I would say the artists, myself and the artists I know, that we're generally the kind of people who want to engage with ethical questions. We want to engage with questions around how are we making art, how are we interacting with the public, and how does it have meaning for us? Mm-hmm. And so I think we're a community of people who are not afraid to have those conversations about, okay, so this is an intellectual property question. Instead of making it a question or a concern, how do we turn it into art? How do we turn it into a solution? How do we turn it into something that's thrilling and exciting and actually bringing something to the piece that we would never get otherwise? So yeah, that idea of putting people into the piece when we talk about trying to get engagement, and there's always going to be audience members who want to see somebody make an idiot of themselves by letting their face be used for whatever, His Royal Highness decides he wants to use it for. And there's always going to be people who like me, who are that fool and want to jump in and want to get up on stage and be made an idiot out of, so it's, it's a fun thing that we can engage different kinds of audience members as well.
Absolutely. There used to be, this is only marginally connected to what you say, but I just remembered there was at the turn of the century, the last century, there was an actual performance thing that you could go see. They get audience volunteers at the beginning, and when they go down to the stage, they'd be given nitrous oxide, laughing gas, and they'd inhale it, and then the audience would just watch them giggle and fall all over themselves on the stage. And this was like a riotous entertainment. People loved it. And then eventually somebody was like, well, that's extremely bad for your health. So they banned it. but
early reality TV.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, again, every modality that's ever existed continues to manifest in a new way. And that, in a way, that is no different than watching the lions and the gladiators fighting the gladiators or the lions. There's a desire for a particular kind of spectacle engagement. And this, I think, modality answers one of the questions, which is you don't have to let one thing or make one thing be everything.
Yeah.
It's totally okay that theater is its own thing and film is its own thing and video is its own thing and this is its own thing. And they just are different forms of expression.
Yeah, that as artists, we don't have to only do one thing. I actually don't know any theater artists who only do one thing. Just in reading your bio, you had like 8 things, and plus all the ones that you didn't put in your bio. So I think it's good to allow ourselves as artists permission to be flexible in what we're capable of. And to see the other work we do, even if we haven't won awards for it yet, or even if we didn't go to school for it, to still see our work in those other areas as valuable. And I think that that's kind of requires a level of self-confidence that's been really, really hard to access since COVID hit. But I hope that things like attending these sessions at this symposium and going to the roundtables and talking to your peers in whatever platforms you can find helps people build themselves back up again and really see and respect their own abilities in new ways. And that's, for me, one of the real overarching values that we have as co-curators creating this symposium in general. So I hope that, that helps people.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that these kinds of conversations are happening because I should have said, and I think it was obvious before I started, but I don't have any definitive answers. I have more questions than answers in doing this work. But I'm not letting those questions restrict my ability to create or to engage or to make more agency for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ability to experiment without expectation of some kind of immediate reward or immediately being perfect at something is a hugely valuable avenue for all of us to pursue as artists right now. Something that I've been reminding myself over and over and over again, and that I hope is maybe useful to some people who are watching, is this idea that, maybe we're like expert theater makers or expert performers in live theater, or whatever we're experts at. We cannot then instantly become experts at this new mode.
Sure.
Right? We can't just sort of say, oh, okay, I'm pivoting from expert status to expert status. If you've already been working in these other modes in virtual reality and augmented reality, like many of our guests have been for 20 years, great. Obviously, you're experts in both. You've been developing both skills alongside one another all this time. But for most of us, we haven't been doing that. We've been, gaining expert status in this one niche, and now we're being asked to pivot. The idea that you would pivot and be at the same level is like, it's not how life works. It's not how art works. It's not how skill building works. The idea is that we're going to we're going to pivot and we're going to be beginners, and allowing ourselves to be beginners. And I think Mark Caniglio said something last week that was so liberating, which is this idea that the audience doesn't expect us to be experts either.
Yeah.
There is a weird, I think he called it a schism. There's like a weird crack in the earth that's opened where the audiences kind of get that we're all just trying, because they themselves are being asked to pivot away from what they're experts at. They themselves are being asked to suddenly offer counseling online through the phone, or do doctor's appointments on the phone, or, everything has changed. And so this idea that we as artists would suddenly be, perfect at whatever it is we're trying to do, the audience doesn't have that expectation of us. So to see that as the massive gift that it could be, and to sort of allow ourselves to be beginners and to be bad at something, but still be willing to share it with people is something that I hope we can offer ourselves, not easy every day.
No, listen, that's a profoundly important also, because I think if you really think about right now, audiences right now, the two things that are live that they really appreciate are news and sports. But other things typically not. I mean, if they're not social engagements, live performance is important, but you can get incredible recorded performance. You can get incredible, like, edited, curated, well-rehearsed, made pieces. But you're in the digital modality, you're competing against those high-level, completely produced things. So part of the reason why this lockdown is obviously terrible, the pandemic is obviously terrible, but one of the things that it's done is it's allowed us to change our perception around the quality of the image that we're looking at, because we understand that we are in a position now that we have to have meetings through like StreamYard or through Zoom or something else. And so there's a degraded quality, video quality, but we go, okay, yeah, but that's my suspension of disbelief. I'll say, that's fine. I'll put that aside. It's okay. What's the quality of the content and the quality of the interaction? And the more that you can get audiences to commit to that, then you can actually make it look a bit sloppy, but still dominate over other pre-recorded media.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise we don't have, like, there is no cabaret for this unless I put a lock on the performance and I do like, a bunch of previews with very small closed audiences of invited people only in order to test the performance and test the functionality before I release it. It's going to be clunky. If I don't do that, it's going to be clunky.
Yeah.
And I either have to say, well, I need to put those restrictions, or say, what if I just keep putting clunky things out there and gradually, hopefully get better?
Yeah.
The audience's aesthetic sensibility will shift as well. And I have to trust that.
Absolutely. It's also really acceptable to do dress rehearsals still. So a number of conversations I've had with people, they thought, okay, but how will we know it'll work on the day? And I say, well, we can test it.
Right,
So I think we've
exactly.
all kind of forgotten that, like, we still know how to do this. We still want to rehearse. We still want to test. We still want to try things ahead. That there are still some practice, some sort of best practices that we can bring from our, previous experience into this. We just have a few more minutes. So I'm going to see, I think we have one more question here.
Another question, yeah.
So if digital performance has a democratizing impact and fosters engagement, what influence, if any, might this have on in-person production?
It's a great question. I don't know definitively in terms of existing models of in-person production how much it would change things. I will say, though, that when I was doing a production of Comedy of Errors at Thousand Island Playhouse, as well as at Theater Aquarius, this was Daryl Cloran had directed. There was a 5-person production. So we were playing multiple characters. The conceit was set up right away that we would do quick changes in front of the audience to play all the different characters in Comedy of Errors. Specifically for the high school audiences, I threw a bunch of meme references.
Right.
At one point, when I say the meat has been salted, then I would do Salt Bay.
Right.
And just the small gesture suddenly made them all sit up, and there was a massive audio response.
Yeah.
I knew they were like, oh, wait, what? Did he just do something that's not 500 years old? What's he doing? And then by doing small things like that, there's those who are purists who would be like, well, you're bastardizing it. But Shakespeare wrote for a populist form. And so I think when I introduced meme culture into the performance, what it did was it activated and engaged the audience so that they didn't have to choose between live and meme culture. They could be like, well, there's some way that you can synthesize. You can put everything together all the time. One of the ways that the in-person production can also shift is, I don't know if you're familiar, you must be familiar with Pepper's Ghost as
Yeah,
as an
absolutely.
effect. So Pepper's Ghost is a foundation for holographics and holographic projection. Holographic projection in a show can be done with the same principles as Pepper's Ghost. So the more that you kind of develop this cognitive augmented reality work, suddenly you can have a show where an audience comes and either they bring their phone or their tablet, or there is one in front of them. And if they choose to so view the show through that, they can see augmented reality aspects there, or they have glasses and they can see things flying. And so there's a tremendous number of ways that you can shift live performance if you integrate these two.
And I think another thing we're going to see too is that some people will discover that this kind of format, this kind of platform for their work becomes one that is more accessible to different audiences. They can reach different geographical locations. They can reach, if their particular audience is a specific community, they can reach that community everywhere in Canada, in every single city in Canada, by doing it this way and promoting it online instead of doing it in person. So I think something that has come up a number of times in all our sessions is that, as we're creating and synthesizing this new modality, building these new forms of art making, it's never going to go away. Some of us are going to say, oh, wow, I love this way more. I love the fact that I can do this and I don't have to raise a $50,000 grant so I can use the theater for 3 days. Like, I like being able to create in this mode. And so we're going to find artists and young artists who are coming up right now, who are just graduating school or like even preschool, post-secondary education, I should say, who are going to say, there's potential here that none of my mentors have tapped. I want to go in that direction. And so I think what we're seeing is a massive introduction of a new tool set, and artists love having tons of tools in their tool bag. Like, no one's going to say, oh, it's not COVID anymore, so we're never going to use augmented reality again. Like, I think this idea that it's just for now is, it just doesn't work with how artists function.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I think that there's no doubt in my mind that this is going to have an increasingly profound impact on all the work that we do. And the democratization is amazing because there's been posited theories about how the more that we try to move in a multinational way, multinational corporate way of the world, the way the world operates, even if we move to like a one world currency, it's never going to stay static and stable that way. What's automatically going to happen is this is going to be fragmentation into tribes and villages. And it's going to eventually get back to the point where civic engagement is the most important engagement. Federal and provincial engagement is not as important as civic, local. And the question is, I always saw that through the lens of geography, where now the geography is the digital sphere. If my so-called tribe or village is spread out all over the world, then that's who I have to cater to. And the only reason I care to broaden that is for capitalist reasons. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. Right?
Yeah, and engagement. And again, as artists, we're the kind of people who like to flit between, right? We like to put our wings on and like go fly over to some other community we don't know about and learn about them. And those kind of like cross-cultural engagements enrich everyone's life. But as you say, they're an enriching factor when it comes to things like safety, security, food. Like, these are all these other factors that we have to defer to in a way as humans. This idea of what is essential services, is something that I think we're all going to be bringing also into our own engagement with our practice, or have already in the past year. Well, that's about our time. There's one fantastic comment that I'll share from the chat, which says Shakespeare was a meme king himself. Absolutely. And also used popular music and things that were, happening on the street would get added into his performances through improvisation. And these are all the tools that we learn about in theater school that we can apply now.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. This is an exciting time to get in on this and start figuring this out.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you all, everyone who watched and who participated by asking questions or commenting in the chat, or just simply by listening. We're so grateful to all of you, and so grateful to His Royal Highness Anand Rajaram for being with me today. Anand, is there anything you want to say at the end?
I just want to thank you so much for this opportunity to come and speak to everyone. And I'm on all social media, so you can find me if you're creating augmented reality or other work. I would love to know what you're doing. I'd love to connect with you. And if you feel like collaborating on something, I'm always open.
I love that.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's such a wonderful spirit to bring to the end of our session. Thank you so much for being here. It was such a fantastic conversation. You're such an engaging artist, and it was wonderful to talk about both the big picture and personal sides of these things. Don't miss an opportunity to see Anand's work either through his social media, or if you want to watch something right now on the levelup.designers.ca website, we have some pieces of Anand's in our digital gallery.